So this is chapter 17, positive reinforcement at home and school. So Sidman first explains that children are always countering new experiences and constantly exploring. And he says that children need help and they demand help from us because they don't understand that adults also have lives to lead. He says it may look like children are trying to annoy us sometimes and like they're coming after us, but really they just want help. And if we react to them with punishment to make them leave us alone, then we become trapped in coercion and counter coercion, and we and our children basically become monsters to each other. So he starts about talking at home. He says becoming parents is really hard because some people have never parented anyone before. And we quickly see that children make special demands. At first, they do this by crying and screaming, which is because it's their only communication system. And sometimes this crying and screaming can actually turn into aggression. He says when reinforcing aggression by providing immediate attention to the aggression, you're pretty much transforming the child into a monster. And he says punishment has side effects. It gives the child no other course of action. So instead of scolding or yelling, giving a child the opportunity to earn a reinforcement will make the child happy and competent. Offering reinforcement every time a child acts bad, he said, will make the child believe he can act bad all the time to get the same reinforcement. So, providing reinforcement and attention every time a misbehavior happens will reinforce the misbehavior. He says a general principle is to pay attention when the child is good and not attend when they are bad. So, when a child makes signs of outbreaking or misbehaving, try to make the child do good and reinforce before they actually have that tantrum or outbreak. Usually, he said, kids don't outbreak right away and they first show signs of complaining or rejection. He says people need to understand how reinforcements work because just giving out good things no matter what will, of course, cause problems. He says we should use reinforcers to make children feel happy and productive without making them feel that they need to always do something special in order to earn love and support. And he explains it's important to have a balance to maintain positive contingencies and at the same time generate trust and security. So you have to make your child know that even if they did something unsuccessful, you're still going to be there for them, you're still going to support them. He says as long as we consider coercion necessary, we will never ask we will never ask ourselves whether another way is possible. And the goal is to set up realistic contingencies that the child can meet. So don't make anything too complicated too soon in their life and find reinforcers that will satisfy the child and the parent. He says sometimes the tantrums and complaining and aggression get out of hand, so you would want to appraise and give approval before they have an outburst or when they quiet down and start acting nicely and appropriately again. So don't give a child attention or interest when they're already misbehaving. Reinforce the behavior you want in the situation where the misbehavior has been occurring and teach the child when asking nicely, when they act nicely, they can mostly get what they want. Sometimes mistakes happen and things don't go according to plan, of course, and in those moments, he says, occasional punishment may be necessary to put a quick halt to a dangerous situation. But he said not to worry because when you have a relationship that is good and you have a lot of good reinforcements, a small punishment here and there won't give long term damage. Positive reinforcement is not just for children, and he says it's for pretty much anyone, for people in marriages and other relationships. Non contingent love can't spoil adults just as children at any age. Love that is uncontingent, he says, is like a one way street. Even with elders, you have to find ways to give them that same attention in return for constructive behavior. So, without reinforcement, behavior won't survive. The next part is in school. So, when used correctly, positive reinforcement, he says, is the most powerful teaching tool. Those that use it have discovered that it works. He says in teacher training, they don't really teach you about using positive reinforcements. And the general principle here is when a student does something new, give them positive reinforcement as quickly as possible. Eventually, teachers have to eliminate all external supports and make learning as its own reward. Learning becomes reinforcing when it makes other reinforcers possible. Positive reinforcements, he says, aren't hard to find and they aren't something new. The usual practice in schools is to go from one topic to another, which ends up ignoring students who pass successfully and punishing those who didn't pass well. In schools, in the lowest grades, most kids are eager to learn, and then when you go from intermediate to high levels of school, all the way to college, he says this balance shifts, it changes, and the unwilling learners predominate the environment. He says if grades were to depend on mastery of material, many students will fail, and that is why there are such things as curves for grading. He then talks about a trial and error learning. He says even with proficient learners, positive reinforcement will not just take away coercion. Coercion comes into the picture when you withhold reinforcement. Reinforcing pupils' successes in trial and error learning is more effective than the usual practice of ignoring their successes, but it still doesn't take away coercion. Students will end up fearing failure and value success only to avoid failure. The only way to eliminate extinction is to eliminate failure itself. New errorless teaching techniques are constantly being discovered and refined. To make errorless learning possible is to have effective programming, and this is something that teachers have to do, not students. So, teaching programs. So, he says something like having prerequisites is one effective program. So, knowing material before proceeding to the next. This way, you can have no errors because you go through steps. Teachers' abilities specify what student is supposed to learn is also effective. An example he gives is if a teacher knows that a student behaviorally likes poetry, then they can design and test programs for teaching that poetry to the student. He said, we cannot know for sure what skills or subject matters to teach, but once we make those decisions, behavior analysis can help us know whether or not we succeeded. Errorless learning is a large research area still being learned, and it has the potential to remove coercion from education. Students who are receiving positive reinforcement for successful learning have no need to seek negative reinforcement through escape and counter control. So the question is, when have you used punishment before with a student or your child? And knowing what you know now from this chapter, how would you handle that situation differently? And would you use positive reinforcement instead?